Pepe Mujica, he wasn't someone who strived for power. He was a totally free individual. He would talk from his heart, which is how we should all be. But with this, it's amazing how rare that is. When he was president of Uruguay from 2010 to 2015. He refused to live in the presidential palace. He continued to live on the farm where I met him. He gave 90% of his wage away. She calls out, she's like, Pepe, there's a journalist from the UK here who's come all the way to interview you. And then there's a pause and he's like, bring him in.
I'm joined on the Crispin Flintoff show by Matt Kennard. How you doing, Matt?
I'm all right. Good to be here. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really pleased that you could join me because I read your article about Pepe Mujica, who passed away this week, and you met him, and it's such an incredible story. I think people should obviously read the article, but obviously hear more about Pepe Mujica because his life is incredible and what he has to say is incredible in the interview. This is a picture of him in the house when you met him. He doesn't look particularly happy to see you, I must say.
No. But to be fair, I had just turned up on a Sunday afternoon out of nowhere. He didn't know who I was. It wasn't a pre-planned interview, so it's quite fair enough. He was 88 at the time, so
yeah. So I mean, I probably look like that if you turned up when I was 88.
Yeah.
It was out of the blue on a Sunday, yeah. But your article, which is here, which I really recommend people read, Pepe Mujica, England is still the guarantor of our independence in Declassified UK, published on the 14th of October. But it's actually you met him on in April. You were saying?
Yeah, I can give a bit of a backstory about how it happened. So I have quite a lot of family in Argentina. So I have gone there regularly for many years, and Uruguay is just across the River Plate from Argentina. So you take a little ferry. It takes like a couple of hours, and then I was there one time when I was in Argentina. We went to Uruguay, and I was in Montevideo, which is the capital. And obviously, I knew about Mujica for many, many years because he's a legend in Latin America. Mainly because of his philosophy of life and how he lives his life, more than his politics. Actually, I mean, we can go into his politics, but that was what set him apart actually from all the left-wing leaders, which came up in Latin America from sort of Chavez in 1998 onwards. He's a very, very thoughtful and sort of I guess I felt like he's kind of got a Buddhist philosophy of life. Like he didn't have many possessions. His farm was very, very sparse and not it wasn't glitzy at all. But anyway, so I was in Uruguay and I'd wanted to interview him for a long time, and I had some friends that knew people around him, and they were like, look, you can't get an interview formally, but you could always just turn up and see what happens at his farm. So I knew I got his address and drove out from Montevideo. It's about 20 minutes outside the capital, Montevideo. Okay, it's a bit sore to knock on a 88-year-old who's I've been told wasn't well, but I was like, I'm never going to get this opportunity again, so I'm going to do it. So I just walked across the road, walked through like this foliage, and it like got to his farmhouse, which is like magical. The whole experience was quite magical in a way. It was quite ethereal, like it was strange. But this little farmhouse, like Little Red Riding Hood, one floor. So I knocked on the door. I didn't know what the front door was, so I knocked on the door. There was no reply, and then I was going to go back to the car, and then there was another door, so I was like, I'll give it a try. Knocked on the door, and then I heard some movement, and then the door unlocked, and then a elderly lady answered the door and was like, hey, what do you want? And I was like, oh, I'm here to interview Pepe Mujica. She was like, what? And I was like, yeah, I've come all the way from England to do it. She's like, she started laughing. She's like, and then she calls out, she's like, Pepe, there's a journalist from the UK here who's come all the way to interview you. And then there's a pause and he's like, bring him in. So, and the woman who answered the door was his wife, who is quite a remarkable person in her own right. She was vice president of Uruguay from 2017 to 2020, and they were guerrilla fighters together in the 70s. That's where they met in the struggle. Anyway, so I went through this the antechamber into the kind of ramshackle kitchen, and he's just sitting there in a little seat reading a book about Lula, who's his friend, the president of Brazil. And he said, "Sit down, ask me whatever you want." So we started the interview, and yeah, it was a really amazing experience, you know, because he's someone who I'd watched for years from afar, and been kind of really interested in how someone like him could get to a presidency, because you know how the power systems work around the world. They filter out any decent human being everywhere, basically. And not only that, they even decent human beings, the ones who usually get to the presidency are ones with an ego. And this guy basically is egoless. He's just like, he wouldn't, he doesn't have that sense of like the self being important. He's all about what can we do as a collective, what can we do to get back to nature. He was very much about humans getting back to nature. And the conversation we had, the most profound parts for me were when he was talking about uh, really deep issues. And what the sense I got from him was basically humans have gone down the wrong path, and we're living at odds with our nature. And he was very much so. His whole, I was asking him at various points about what's your message to young people, and he said, "Look, the problem is the society we live in, which is a consumerist society. We're told we get meaning from consuming and buying." And he said that's all that doesn't work. That's a function of capitalism. That's the reason we're given that philosophy and we're given that creed is not because it is in tune with our nature. It's because it helps the economic system carry on. And he said what we need to do is just get back to nature, not work too much. That's the other thing he said. He said that you shouldn't live to work. You know, we should have spare time. And he mentioned actually Athens. He was like, look where all the most amazing intellectual progress was made in Athens. You know, over a 200-year period with philosophy, theatre, all that stuff. He said that was because, well, there's a bad side to it. It's because slaves exist, but there was a class of people that had free time to think and to analyze the world, politics, literature themselves, which we don't have. And again, that's another function of capitalism, is that we're worked to the bone. And you do hear like this kind of stuff said by some people, and you sort of think, well, you don't really believe it, or it's kind of just you're saying it to sound profound. But he lived it. You know, he lived it when he was president of Uruguay from 2010 to 2015. He refused to live in the presidential palace. He continued to live on the farm where I met him. He gave 90% of his wage away when he was president. And he offered to put Syrian refugees in a presidential palace instead. I don't know if that actually happened, but it became quite famous that he offered it.
So people know more about him. I'll read out what you wrote about his backstory so people can see where he was coming from. Mujica joined the armed left-wing resistance in Uruguay as a young man in the mid-1960s, becoming a member of the newly formed MLN Tupamaros movement, a group inspired by the recent Cuban Revolution. The group pushed for redistribution of wealth to the poor. He participated in the brief 1969 takeover of Pando, a town close to Montevideo, leading one of 6 squads assaulting strategic points in the city. In March 1970, he was shot 6 times while resisting arrest at a Montevideo bar, while 2 policemen were injured in the exchange. Mujica was captured by the authorities on 4 occasions. He is among the more than 100 Tupamaros who escaped Punta Carretas prison in September 1971 by digging a tunnel from inside the prison that led to the living room of a nearby home. He was captured but escaped again. The Tupamaros had also in 1971 kidnapped the British ambassador to Uruguay, Sir Geoffrey Jackson, who they held captive for 9 months.
Yeah, crazy story, isn't it? I
There's
mean,
a picture of him there. He doesn't look like someone you'd want to mess around with. 2 years later, the 1973 coup d'etat in Uruguay installed a vicious military junta that ruled the country until 1985. This right-wing regime outlawed political parties, dissolved unions, and censored the media in order to preserve its control. It was also a key player in the continent-wide CIA-backed terror network in the region, codenamed Operation Condor. And this is what he says in your interview. Well, now we lived a very hard experience, he tells me. I was in prison for more than 12 years, but I spent 7 years without a book, nothing, almost no visits. This was from 1972 to 85. You ask him, what impact did that have on him? I had to learn to resist as best as I could and to revalue certain things. I learned a lot, he says. I learned because when I was very young, I read a lot, but I hadn't thought about what I had read, and not having books or anything, but with time, I started to think. He was released when democracy was restored in 1985. When we were released, we emerged from a very strong dictatorship, and we collectively decided that we had to adhere to the law because otherwise we would be like provocation to a society that had gotten rid of the dictatorship.
I think that his whole being, his whole philosophy, derives from that time in prison because he was saying that there's 7 years of that was he was without a book, but I've read more about what those 7 years were like, and it was basically he was in a hole in the ground. He was in complete solitary confinement, didn't see anyone, no reading materials. So imagine 7 years with just your own thoughts, and you don't know when you're going to get out either. So it gave him I guess a peacefulness in a weird way, like because he only had himself to talk to for 7 years, and actually his political outlook changed. He also discusses this
Mm.
in the interview. Like, obviously he was an armed left-wing guerrilla, and was involved in violence, but when he came out, and he was a Leninist back then, like he believed that you needed the masses needed to be led by a cadre of, I don't know, revolutionaries. But when he came out, he had changed his ideas and was much more into negotiation and to triangulating with different parts of the left. And in 1971, they created what's called the Frente Amplio, which is the broad front, which still exists. In fact, the president is part of that now. The current president of Uruguay, who won the election last year, and that was a coalition of all different left groups, from communists to social democrats to liberals. I mean, there's lessons here for us in the UK as well about how we do stuff. The most profound parts of that interview and the most profound parts of things I've seen outside is his more general philosophy on life, and how we derive meaning from life, and how we've unfortunately derived meaning from all the wrong things in our society, and it promotes ego, and it promotes the idea of individualism, and he went against all that. I mean, and I also said to him, look, it's hard for someone like me because I'm from London, and growing up in London, it's this belly of the beast. We're like the financial capital of the world, and I don't have the opportunity to go into nature. And he was like, yeah, but you can always find ways to live the right life. He said, whatever context you're in, you can find ways to live the right life. You just got to start looking, and you got to escape the culture that is presented to you. And the other interesting thing he said politically was, he was saying that he was much more economically determinist before, like sort of Marxist idea that everything's about economics and everything's about how the economic system works. And in his older age, he was saying that he changed to understand that culture is a much more important variable in terms of how you can get the masses on side for any kind of progressive project, which is quite interesting as well. And I kind of do agree with that. And I was sitting there listening to him, and he was a totally free individual, and thinking, wow, how the hell did this guy get to the presidency? And in fact, I did ask him that, and his wife laughed. She was like, yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
This quote here, this is what you're sort of talking about with what he says about uh, philosophy, in a sense, about how he sees society. I find the roots of socialism in anthropology. Sapiens were historically socialist animal. They lived in groups for more than 200,000 years. Agriculture began 10 to 15,000 years ago. Yesterday, And that's where yours and my history began. Inside, we carry that nostalgia, and one day it will be proven whether genetic memory exists. Does he think it's still there? I see traces of that genetic memory. People who live in an apartment and have a little plant or a dog or have a stove, right, which is something that stands in for firewood, even if it is gas. Or when a man goes with a car to the supermarket, he looks like a hunter. When you said about the philosophy side of it, just that kind of reminded me of when I was studying philosophy, the kind of state of nature arguments, like the Rousseau thing about how we are society, we all look out for each other. It's only when someone put a piece of rope around a piece of land that the whole thing went wrong.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
and that kind of outlook is so alien to what we get now,
mm,
but it's so important in as a vision of what we are as human beings, because in a way we are being lost in this kind of
mm,
commercial, constant bombardment of capitalism in our faces. And what
mm,
he said there just seems to be, let's have a look at who we really are. What are human beings? And
mm.
I found that really interesting. And
And also, I found like what you're saying there is, despite the system's um, desire to grind us down and to shape us into the mold that makes the system work, you see humans resist. We do have a strong nature, and you can that's what you're saying there, isn't it? That you can, like, we put a plant in our with the desire to the inbuilt genetic memory that he's talking about expresses itself even within the society we live in, and they can't repress it completely. And the other interesting thing about him is that what he's saying there it is a criticism of capitalism and the values it bestows on us. But he's also saying, like, you can live, and that's the lesson that I got from him. That although we do live in this corrupted system, you can live a good life still if you search for it. Like, Uruguay is not it's a capitalist country. It's got inequality. In fact, it's got a lot of inequality. It's got a lot of poverty. But he lived within it in a true way, true to himself, and also true to our nature. So that it is hopeful to that extent. You know, he was a and he's so interesting because he's such an outlier, but really he shouldn't be. You know, we could all be like that if we actually set about doing it and practice the principles that we preach. So it is. I think that his story is a hopeful one, and I was pretty sad when the news came in, but I was also just thinking, wow, what an incredible life, man! What a just unreal. Like, he did everything he wanted to do. And I asked him towards the end of the interview, "Are you scared of death?" And he said he wasn't, and I didn't find that surprising at all, because he'd lived according to his principles. I'm sure he had some regrets, but not. I don't even know if he had any. Like, he'd lived always according to what he believed in, and according to his nature. So why would you regret it? And he said, it's a miracle I was ever here. So why would I be scared about going?" So yeah, it was. He's different to any figure I've ever interviewed. Uh, Definitely political, because even I've interviewed amazing liberation leaders in Latin America, like Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, but they're still political animals in the sense of, like, they're not philosophers. They were. This is why it's so unusual for someone like Pepe Mujica to get to the presidency, because he wasn't someone who strived for power. He didn't look for it. He's a bit like Jeremy Corbyn to that extent, you know. Like, Jeremy Corbyn was just accidentally chosen to be leader. He'd never actually. You can tell in his whole comportment and his political history, he'd never actually taken any decision in a way to get power, but it was bestowed on him just out of nowhere. So he was a totally free individual. There was none of his thought was clouded by concerns about how he'd appear, or how he'd get power, or how he'd get status, or how he would talk from his heart, which is how we should all be. But, with this, it's amazing how rare that is. You know, not just a politician, everyone's always concerned, has ideas about how am I appearing, how will this be taken by this person, or so. I just felt with him, He was speaking completely from the heart. He had no concern about apart from speaking his truth and the truth. And also, he had a beautiful relationship with his wife. That was like a very profound part of it, because obviously she answered the door, but when I went in and interviewed him, they'd been, so their Sunday routine obviously is they'd just been sitting reading their books at a mini little table opposite each other, and they've been together for since the 70s, so nearly 50 or over 50 years, and she just sat there. I mean, she found I got the sense that they found it quite funny how much of an international celebrity he is, because he doesn't seek it, he never sought it, and obviously the way he is not your usual celebrity. But she sat opposite, just listening to him attentively, helping me with when I was struggling with my Spanish, um, and he said at one point, he said, "Oh, we live happily together." So, and one of the main reasons I was sad, but particularly sad when I heard he died, was I was just putting myself back to that little farmhouse, because it's quite out in the sticks. There's nothing around it, and I was just imagining her. She'd lived there for decades with Pepe, her soulmate, and then suddenly he's gone. That won't be easy to adjust, but adjust. I'm sure she will. But she, as I said, she's a pretty incredible woman in her own right. They never had kids, which obviously I didn't ask about, but I was wondering why they never had kids. Maybe they couldn't, but his I think that his legacy will live on. That's because what he said was so profound, but also how he lived his life true to his ideals, changed Uruguay forever and changed Latin America. He was loved by everyone. That is the most amazing thing about him. People like Evo Morales, Lula, like, I've got a lot of love for them, but the right hate them. Liberals hate them. Whereas Pepe Mujica had this strange quality that everyone kind of liked him, even the people, like, everyone could, because he was so deeply human. People could, the politics wasn't a barrier to engaging with him, or to to any kind of, there was no human barrier there, so the right really liked him there, and that was helped by his philosophy about constant negotiation, and you can't be too dogmatic about anything. But I learned a lot in that experience. I learned a lot about politics, philosophy, but also just about how we should live our lives. And I can't say I've like integrated all of that stuff into my life, but for me it was a window into things don't have to be as they are, and we can live our lives in a truthful way, and in a way that makes us happy, without having to engage with a culture which is corrupted and disgusting in many ways.